but then you have this corresponding increase in violence. And the question was by the incident in Minnesota 2 days ago, where a woman who was part of the protest, who had gone there specifically to participate in the protest against ICE, to seemingly impede ICE officers as part of the protest, was shot and killed as she tried to drive away from the ICE agents who were demanding she get out of her car. There's pretty much a consensus on the right that's very pro-ICE that the shooting was justified and that she got what she deserved because an ICE agent was in front of the car as it was pulling out. And the claim is that he justifiably feared for his life and was therefore entitled not to try and get out of the way, but just to shoot her in the head, which he did. And then there are huge amounts of people more on the left. I don't mean the real left. I mean, just like kind of left of center, who are pretty unanimous that this was an absolutely unjustified murder. We've kind of covered some angles of that, but I think what I want to talk about, and actually there's this suggestion within the question about it. And actually, before I do, you probably have seen most of the videos. To me, the key factor, as I've said before, is the fact that when she was pulling out, she was getting away. The ICE agents had tried to pull her out of her car, open the door. She pulled away and immediately turned her steering wheel to the right, which is exactly what you do if you were trying to get out of the situation and flee, as opposed to running down an ICE agent. But as I said, I understand how people see that differently. There will be investigations. I think it's disturbing that we have government officials like J.D. Vance and others who are pronouncing basically a verdict in this case. I don't think that's the responsibility or even the right of political leaders to do. But that is to me how it looked. But again, there are a lot of people who see it differently. So there was a newly released video today. This is cell phone footage taken from the phone of the ICE agent who actually did the shooting. And the minute it was released to something called Alpha News, a very pro-Trump, MAGA, right-wing news outlet. It seems like ICE gave it to them. That's almost certainly where it came from, the cell phone of the ICE agent. And the conservatives immediately began declaring that this is definitive proof that she did in fact try to run him over, and he was therefore justified in shooting her. Everybody who does not have that view of ICE does not see this video that way. So I'm just going to show it to you since it's a new video. Some of you may not have seen it. Again, this is from the cell phone of the ICE agent who ended up drawing his gun and aiming at her and shooting her fatally.
Change our plates every morning, just so you know. It'll be the same plate when you come talk to us later. That's fine. U.S. citizen, former fucking veteran. You want to come at us? You want to come at us? I say go get yourself some lunch, big boy. Go ahead.
Out of the car. Get out of the fucking car. Get out of the car.
Oh!
Fucking bitch.
I've seen video of this that I think has been much more revealing than that. Again, it was the person who did the shooting, so it was from his perspective. I already gave the interpretations, the competing interpretations. Obviously, there was some, I guess you could call it, adversarial energy between the woman who was driving the car, who ended up killed, her wife, her partner, who was the woman with the short hair, who was speaking in a fairly condescending way to ICE agents. It's absolutely, you're right. You're allowed to speak. You don't have to speak deferentially and respectfully to agents of the state. You have the right to speak critically, especially when you're at a protest. The driver said, "I'm not mad at you, dude." And, it was not like a very polite, earnest statement. It had a tinge of sarcasm to it. And then the wife of the woman who was shot was, being confrontational, saying we change our plates, we're going to have different plates the next time, kind of like mocking him in a light way. Nothing of that, independent of the driving, remotely justifies shooting an American citizen in the head in broad daylight on an American street, obviously. And I don't think that's the claim, but the claim is this shows that they had kind of an antagonistic relationship with ICE, which is a huge leap from that to this woman who had basically no criminal record, was raising a 6-year-old child, tried on that day to go run over ICE agents, kill them, be willing to go to jail, domestic terrorism, all of that. So that's the video that was released today. I think one of the things that we're seeing, and this is the point I actually want to emphasize, as opposed to just delving into the debate that is very tired by now. All the arguments are very well known about who was at fault, who wasn't. I've already given my view on that. Is that obviously, as we all know, when Charlie Kirk was murdered in this very brutal way on camera, and everybody watched that horrific image of a bullet entering his neck while he was just sitting there expressing his political views on a campus in a nonviolent way, there were a good number of people who celebrated Charlie Kirk's murder and said he deserved it because of his political views. A lot of conservatives have wildly exaggerated who did that. No members of Congress did that. No leaders of the Democratic Party did that. No very prominent liberals in media did that. It's mostly confined to people on the internet, but there was a fair amount of sentiment that immediately emerged that was designed to say Charlie Kirk got what he deserved. It was celebratory about the fact that he was killed, even though he's a husband, a father of 2 young children who at the time was not engaged in any kind of provocative or violent behavior. And that was very disturbing. Just the fact that you could watch a life of a young man be extinguished in an instant by a bullet going through the neck. I think a lot of people who were decent watched that video and had kind of a reaction that was kind of horrifying, and sort of watched so many people instantly on the internet celebrate the death, say that he deserved it, start mocking it. I do think that revealed a kind of crudeness and a vulgarity, kind of a dehumanization that maybe comes from just being online. This is not necessarily reflective of who these people are. Comes from being anonymous online, from groupthink, from getting caught up in the sentiments of the moment. But I think a lot of those people actually think that way, that if you are a Trump supporter, if you're on the right, if you have said things about race or gender that you find offensive, it's not enough to criticize a person, not enough to try and get them excluded from decent company. They actually deserve to die. They actually deserve to be killed. And there was a lot of that sentiment, and I wasn't surprised. I have seen that sentiment on large parts of American liberalism and the American left. And it didn't surprise me, but it is something that I find very concerning. And the right went way too far with it. There were people who were simply posting Charlie Kirk's words and critiquing him, which you have every right to do when a prominent, influential person dies. There's a big difference between celebrating the death and expressing criticisms of them. And they got a lot of people fired from their jobs simply for criticizing Charlie Kirk, which I thought was also quite destructive. There was just a professor actually who got summarily fired because he posted nothing more than a Charlie Kirk quote that obviously he meant critically. Didn't celebrate the college, now has to pay him, I think, something like close to $1 million for violating his due process rights and free speech rights. But I do think there was a coarseness and a dehumanization to the reaction that people rightly were kind of horrified by. But what really bothered me also about that was this idea that only happens on the left and not the right. And you see now, in the wake of the killing of this American citizen, that there's a lot of that sentiment on the right now too, which is that first it was kind of justifying the fact that this woman, Nicole Good, was shot, which is a valid argument. Not one I agree with, but obviously you have the right to debate. Was the use of fatal deadly force by an ICE agent justified or not? That's totally legitimate debate. But then it became an attempt to dehumanize her and demonize her. I think a lot of people on the right were disappointed that it wasn't an immigrant, that it wasn't an illegal immigrant, that it wasn't a person of color, it was a white woman. But then they kind of felt like they hit the jackpot. She turned out to be a lesbian. And they're all, I mean, you can't find anyone on the right, barely, talking about her and this killing without constantly saying she was a lesbian. Matt Walsh called her a lesbian agitator who had a humiliating and destructive death, or a humiliating and demeaning death because she was defending Somalians with an IQ of 68 who would never defend her. And from there, there was a lot of sentiment over the last 48 hours. A very viral tweet saying, "Oh, good, I saved her 6-year-old son from being transed by this gay couple." Obviously, a celebratory tweet saying the ICE agent was heroic, saving her child from their degeneracy. And from there, that led to a lot of celebratory tweets that, again, it's not that members of Congress are doing it, but JD Vance did call her, or Kirsten Noem called her a domestic terrorist. JD Vance has been very aggressive in talking about her in a way that suggests she deserves this. And then it crossed the line into, yeah, we want people like that killed. And I was always impatient with this idea that only people on the left celebrate the death of their political opponents, but people on the right would never do such a thing. Such obvious deceit. I've seen that come from the right. I've seen it come from the left. Oftentimes, as I said, it is coming from the sewer of the internet, the sewer where people are anonymous and so are able to say things that they otherwise wouldn't say. Important to put out. And I was on Judge Napolitano's show, Andrew Napolitano's show, on Wednesday, and we talked about the shooting in Minneapolis, and we were also talking about American imperialism. And I made this connection, and then Tucker Carlson in his newsletter this morning, I'm sure he didn't hear me, but he made a similar point, which is that, and I wrote about this before during the War on Terror, which is that when you're a country like the United States that is constantly fighting wars in countless different countries, I think it's very important to realize that the United States is very, very anomalous in this regard. Only Israel fights as many wars in as many places, but the United States is the world champion, the undisputed world champion. Just to give you a comparison, China, the last time it fought a war was 1979. It's 47 years ago, and that war was a 1-month border dispute with Vietnam. They haven't had a war in 47 years. We've had dozens, depending on how you define war, but certainly bombing and changing governments and invading and droning. So we are a country that is very war inclined. We fight more wars by far than any other country. And when that happens, in order to get the population to accept those wars, to believe they're just, to support them, you have to constantly dehumanize other people. You have to constantly talk about them in a way that leads Americans to believe that their life has no value. They deserve to die. The world is a better place when their lives are extinguished. I've talked before about one of the things I really appreciate about the Catholic Church, and it's ironic that there are a lot of people who claim an allegiance to the Catholic Church or membership in the Catholic Church, and yet they sound as contrary to what the church says or what the Pope says about the sanctity of human life, people like Matt Walsh. But what I've always said about the Catholic Church is that they, I think, have a genuine, earnest belief in the sanctity of human life. And it doesn't just manifest in their opposition to abortion, but also to things like their opposition to euthanasia and their opposition to the death penalty. And then in general, just kind of an inclination to condemn war, to be concerned about the lives that are ending, because the central tenet of most religions is that life is created by God and life is the most sacred thing there is. And it doesn't mean you have to be, you're a pacifist necessarily. It doesn't mean that you never are justified in taking human life, certainly in self-defense, for example. Although you can find places in the gospel about turning the other cheek even when somebody strikes you. There's other places in the Old Testament about an eye for an eye and the like. But certainly the sanctity of human life, the fact that life is sacred, is something that is central to most religions. And if you're a country constantly at war, you have to deliver the opposite message. You're constantly giving reasons why the lives we're extinguishing at all different places all over the world doesn't really have that kind of value. In fact, the people are probably primitive or subhuman. Their lives aren't really worth caring about. In fact, they deserve to die. The world is a better place when you extinguish that life. And if you do that over and over, year after year, about so many different people in so many different parts of the world, you do make the society cruder and just generally coarser and more inclined to dismiss the inherent value of human life. And it becomes much easier to be violent, to celebrate the death of people you dislike. Martin Luther King talked about that in his one of the speeches that he gave that I liked the most, which was in 1967 in Riverside Church in Harlem, when he apologized for not having opposed the Vietnam War earlier. And he explained that he thought that he could just focus on domestic politics and violence in the inner cities and violence against the American people by the government. But then he realized you can't extricate those things. If we're going around the world killing people and justifying war and violence and the extinguishment of human life in foreign countries, it's also going to affect how we see our fellow citizens as well. And I absolutely believe that our foreign policy, the fact that we're constantly at war, we're constantly killing people, we're constantly bombing people. Yeah, we got those people on those boats off Venezuela. We wiped them out. Who cares about due process? They're narco-terrorists. Yeah, we bombed Iran. They totally deserved it. The Israelis killed these scientists and these people in buildings and their families. They all deserve it. Yeah, we're going to celebrate it. Not even lament it, even if you find it justifiable. I'll just tell you this quick story, and this is the last thing I'll say about this. When the United States killed Osama bin Laden, finally found him in Pakistan under President Obama in 2010 or 11. I forget which. I think it was 2011. And we found him as this old, decrepit man who was sick and elderly, living with his wives in Pakistan. President Obama went on television that night to announce it. And I was in the United States that day, but I was flying back to Brazil that evening. So I was on an airplane when President Obama made the announcement that we had found and killed Osama bin Laden. And it was at the time, there was very little Wi-Fi on airplanes. And even if there is, I generally don't use Wi-Fi on planes. I like to use planes as a kind of off the matrix, disconnected time. So I didn't know when I landed in Brazil that the United States had found and killed Osama bin Laden. And I got to the airport and I got a cab. And the cab driver said, "Oh, where are you from?" And I said, "Oh, I'm American, but I live here." And he said, "Did you see the news about how the United States had killed Osama bin Laden?" And I said, "What? No, I didn't see that. I was on the plane." He said, "Yeah, the United States killed Osama bin Laden." And that night there were these these celebrations in the streets of Washington and New York. People were waving the American flag and with their fists in the air and were just raucous, like they had won the Super Bowl. And this cab driver said, "Look, I understand why the United States would kill Osama bin Laden. I can understand the arguments that it's justifiable. But what kind of people go around celebrating the extinguishing of human life? Like, even if most countries, a lot of countries, is a Catholic country, Brazil is, it doesn't have the death penalty. And there's an idea of the sanctity of human life that probably comes from religion." And when he said that, I probably wouldn't have thought about this on my own, but I did realize, like, yeah, there is something very odd and probably unhealthy about human beings going around celebrating the fact that we just pumped bullets into some guy who was in his house, even if it's Osama bin Laden. And I do think that comes from, as Martin Luther King said, as studies show, as other historians of empires have pointed out, this has happened with other empires. When you're constantly killing people in faraway places, then it starts to infect the imperial capital. That a lot of our discourse has become extremely indifferent to the value of human life. It's not surprising to see people celebrating the assassination of someone like Charlie Kirk or the killing of this woman. He's not a criminal. Doesn't have a criminal record, never set out to hurt anybody before. She's definitely an activist. She's a left-wing activist. And if you don't share her politics, that should definitely not be enough for you, even if you think the ICE agent was justified, to start talking about her like she got what she deserved and you're happy she's dead. There's a lot of that sentiment, and it's very similar to how people reacted who disliked Charlie Kirk. And I think that is a sign of a pretty unhealthy, and even I would go so far to say as a sick society. And I think it's very inextricably linked with our very aggressive and violent foreign policy. All right, next question. Actually, there's another point I wanted to make here about this killing by ICE in Minneapolis. The argument of those justifying it, principally on the right, is that if a law enforcement officer gives you an order, you should obey it and not ignore it or defy it. So if an ICE agent tells you get out of your car, you don't drive off, you get out of your car. And if you drive off, you're probably going to suffer consequences. I don't think in general we consider it justified to put bullets into the heads of people who flee a scene. In fact, that is not protocol for any police department. You're not justified in just shooting somebody because they're fleeing. And it's certainly not justified for ICE. That is a law enforcement agency that's supposed to be about protecting the border and deporting illegal immigrants, not American citizens, although there are times when they can act against American citizens. But the argument is that she defied an order of the police and therefore was to blame for starting this entire incident. And then at the same time, even if she weren't intending to kill the police officer, the fact that he had some reasonable fear that he was in danger justified pumping bullets into her head. And I understand that standard in theory, but one of the big controversies of the last 6 years was January 6th. And I was very much somebody who believed that the evils of January 6th were wildly exaggerated. I never considered it to be anything close to an insurrection, and I still don't. I consider it to be a protest that got a little bit out of hand and turned into a riot, but it was nothing that threatened the United States or its stability or the existence of the government. I thought the fatal shooting of Ashley Babbitt was horrific. She didn't pull out any arms. She wasn't engaged in violence. They just shot her. But if this is the standard, then it absolutely is the case, if you apply that standard January 6th, that the Capitol Police not only had the right to, but should have shot dozens of January 6th protesters. The vast, vast, vast majority of January 6th protesters were nonviolent. And that was one of the reasons I found their very excessive prosecution and imprisonment to be so outrageous. We don't put people in prison for years for participating in a protest when they're not engaged in violence. They just walked into the Capitol simply because other people who were there did engage in violence. That is not a form of acceptable American justice. But there was a minority, and not a couple of people, but dozens, who did use violence on January 6th, and they used it against police officers. And I don't mean they just punched the police officer. I mean they beat the shit out of police officers. They used flagpoles and sticks and fists and stun guns and whatever they could get their hands on. And these police officers were outnumbered. And they absolutely had a reasonable basis to fear for their lives. And several police officers, that was exaggerated by the media, died on January 6th. Several of them were seriously injured, seriously and permanently injured. Many of them were hospitalized. And there's no doubt they had a reasonable fear for their lives and for their physical safety. And obviously, the people who were beating the shit out of them were defying orders, legal orders from a law enforcement agency that was telling them to stay out of the Capitol. Most of this happened outside of the Capitol when they were trying to prevent people coming in. A lot of the protesters were allowed in and just waltzed in. Again, those were the nonviolent ones, but the ones who beat the police officers with weapons, with things they picked up that severely injured them, whether it was outside or inside, why didn't the police have the right to just gun dozens of them down? Just put bullets in them. If that's justified whenever someone defies a legal order of the police and puts the police in reasonable fear of their physical well-being and safety and life. And I have absolutely zero doubt that if there was some kind of Antifa protest or Black Lives Matter protest, and there was a police officer who was being beaten by, say, 8 Antifa protesters with flagpoles and 2x4s and metallic objects, and as a result pulled out his gun out of fear for his life and shot one or several, everybody on the right would defend that police officer and say he was absolutely within his right to do that. There's no way to, if that's the standard you're upholding, to say that Capitol Hill police officers didn't have that same right, that they should have gunned down multiple people on January 6th, the ones who were using violence. But the reason these standards aren't being applied is the point. It's that this is political violence. It's politically motivated violence. People are cheering when their political adversaries, Charlie Kirk or the woman in Minnesota who has left-wing politics, when the political enemies, people with different political views than you are killed, that's when you jump into action and start defending it and cheering it. There are no consistent standards. There are no coherent views about when this should happen. I personally think, like war, which should be a last resort, should be a last resort for law enforcement agencies to fatally shoot American citizens on the streets of the United States. And I don't think that would have been the case on January 6th, and I don't think that was the case in Minnesota. But some people, when I made this point, said, yeah, I think the ICE shooting was justified, and I think the Capitol Police would have been in the rights to just gun down people on January 6th. And at least that's consistent. What bothers me a lot is not just the inconsistency, but the fact that there seems to be a politically motivated view of who should live and who should die. And societies that abandon the universal sanctity of life and start cheering for the death of their political opponent almost always end up in very dark places. And I also think, as the question suggested, that we very well may be headed there. Thanks for watching this clip from System Update, our live show that airs every Monday through Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern, exclusively on Rumble. You can catch the full nightly shows live or view the backlog of episodes for free on our Rumble page. You can also find full episodes the morning after they air across all major podcasting platforms, including Spotify and Apple. All the information you need is linked below. We hope to see you there.